Hi, my name is Shayla Rich, and this is Lab 4, Oscillations. Alright, so to introduce this experiment, the purpose of this lab experiment was to use experimental and computational models to observe the 2D motion of a spring mass system moving with an oscillating pattern. Alright, and moving on to the relevant physics principles, first we have the energy principle, or the law of conservation of energy, which basically just states that energy can never be destroyed, instead just transferred or transformed to something else. And then we have the position update formula and the velocity update formula, which we'll be using in the computational model. And then we also have the equations for the energies of a system. The first one here is the kinetic energy equation. This is the gravitational potential energy equation. And there's also the spring potential energy equation, but I could not find a picture for that. But it is there and is relevant. All right, so for a brief overview of the results, the change in the energy was 0 in the closed system, so the energy principle was upheld. Moving on to the procedures, we created a video of a spring mass system with 2D motion, or we used the one that was already given to us. We put that video in Tracker to obtain the position at each time interval. We created a CSV with that position data, put the CSV in GlowScript to obtain the computational model, and then we discussed the results. Moving on to the experimental model, this is the video. And for this experiment, the system was the mass and spring, and the surroundings was everything else that was interacting with that system. Right now, we're going to be calculating the initial conditions, or specifically the initial position and initial velocity. Right here, we have the initial time, initial x positions, and initial y positions. And velocity equals change in displacement over change in time. And right here, we calculated the initial velocity to be 2.6 times 10 to the negative 2 in the x direction, negative 0.210 in the y direction, and 0 in the z direction. Right, for the computational model, right here we have the initial condition, so this was the mass of the weight which was already given to us. And then we have the initial velocity and position, which we got from calculating out in the last slide. Right here we have the gravitational constant, the spring constant, which was also given to us, the relaxed length of the spring, which was also given to us. Right here we have basically just stuff to do with the length of the spring. And right here we have all of the system energies, the initial ones which we calculate using the mass and the positions and stuff. And over here, this is the actual computational loop, which we use to update the energies and the position and velocity. So we have the initial energies right here, the gravitational force vector, the spring force, the net force, which is just F grav plus F spring. Then this is where we do our position and velocity update. We update the spring, and then right here, we update all of the energy changes, which we do using the initial energies right here. And these are the results from that computational model. This was the image that was outputted. This was the change in energy graph, and this was the x and y position compared to the experimental model. The possible sources of error in this experiment were human error. I could have totally inputted something wrong whenever I was making the CSV file. And GlowScript errors, I could have put the center of mass at a different place than it should have been. Moving on to the discussion, is the energy principle justified? As we can see right here, delta E, which is this orange line, always stays at 0, and that means there is no change in energy in the system. Even though the specific energies have fluctuating values, the total energy is constant and the change in energy is 0, so yes, the energy principle is justified. And next, we're going to be estimating two separate values of the oscillation period using the x and y values that we obtained in Tracker earlier, and then we're going to be comparing them. So the period of a wave is the time it takes to go from one peak to the next, or one trough to the next. To find the period, I looked for the highest points in the data set, and I found the time between them. So for period of x, the average time between those two peaks was 1.65 seconds, and for the period of y, the time between those two peaks was 1.58 seconds. So even though they are very similar, they're not exactly the same. The period being slightly lower in the y direction kind of indicates there is higher stiffness in that direction, and the spring kind of prefers to move in the to move in the y direction rather than the x. Right, for final conclusions, since there were slight variations between the computational and experimental model, there might have been work done on the physical system which led to those differences, but overall both experiments upheld the energy principle.